Tom, see, I'm struggling to understand what exactly this ruling means. On the one hand, it says Donald Trump enjoys absolute immunity, and on the other, it says it does not enjoy any immunity. But the catchphrase here is official, unofficial. How should one read this? I mean, was it likely that what Donald Trump did during Capitol Hill riots was an official act?
Um, I I think the opinion kind of implies that bits of it might be. I would say I suspect when it gets interpreted and ruled by the lower courts and possibly ruled by the Supreme Court again, very little of it will actually end up being an official act. But what they're saying is there is a presumptive immunity to anything that's official. So, for example, communications with the vice president, you assume that's part of his job. That's part of him being president. If you're going to argue it's not, that has to be very clear fact-based ruling you don't. So at minimum, this will lead to lots of delays while they dispute what was official and what wasn't official. I would actually say most of it, this would be my guess, will stand and will be seen as unofficial. I don't think that necessarily means President Trump will be convicted, or if he's convicted, those convictions will stand, because I think he has lots of other arguments that it's not against the law. But I suspect what the official immunity will mostly do is delay while there's lots of arguments for this unprecedented situation while you're prosecuting the president for stuff he did when he was president. And that will lead
Okay.
to lots of arguments back and forth, but delay it well beyond November.
Okay, let's try to make it easier for our audience, Tom. Now, okay, we're trying to understand whether or not what he did was an official act or not, but do we know what kind of acts are considered unofficial for a president? Are there any examples?
Well, I suppose a classic example would be President Nixon's role in covering up a crime, and in seeking to hide information that concealed that he knew about a crime and possibly was involved with it in the 1970s. So I think that would be a classic example. What you can't do, though, is say just, oh, if it was a crime otherwise, then it would be a crime full stop. The president does lots of things, right? The president orders people killed just as part of foreign policy and war. That doesn't mean it's a crime, even though if you or I were ordinary Americans and did it, we'd be a crime. So the answer is there's actually a very big grey area. There are a lot of arguments backwards and forwards. A key point is if the president is asserting his authority, then it can't be a crime. And that's what impeachment's for.
Oh,
Impeachment is for getting rid of the president.
this is how I am looking at it, and correct me if I'm wrong. If a president does something for the benefit, or at least with the motivation to benefit the whole country, for the benefit of the country, then it's considered an official act. But if it's something for his or her personal gain, then it's considered an unofficial act. Is that a correct assessment,
There
Tom?
has been attempts to assert it's like that. I don't think. I think mostly that's been disproven. I don't think when one thinks about it that can stand up. So, for example, President Biden has been trying to give relief to people who've borrowed money for their university degrees. Now, could you say that he's just doing that to get re-elected? So it's purely selfish. It comes down to people's motivations, and courts, particularly the current court, are very wary about saying, "Oh, a politician's motivated by political reasons, therefore it's illegal." So I think it will be closer. The reason why I think lots of this will stand will be he just wasn't acting as president; he was acting as a candidate. He was saying, I'm having this election stolen," which candidates can potentially say, but that's nothing about being president in there. I don't think you could just say he was being personally selfish, because then most presidential acts, if they're political, you could say, oh, he's being selfish, therefore they're not legal. And that obviously opens a huge can of worms where the courts will be second guessing everything the president does.
But Tom, I think one thing is clear at this point. This verdict is going to further the political divide, exacerbate rather the political divide in the country. We are seeing protests happening outside the Supreme Court, some people holding banners. Donald Trump is not above the law. In the meanwhile, Donald Trump has welcomed this verdict, saying that it's a win for democracy. So a lot of political drama unfolding in the United States. And correct me if I'm wrong, this opinion is also going to have an impact on criminal cases that Donald Trump is currently facing in Florida, Washington, and Georgia.
I think the Georgia case it will probably have an impact in. The Washington and Florida ones, if I'm not getting confused, because there's so many cases, are more personal because they're more about when he's no longer president. So I don't think they'll have quite such a big impact. I'm not so sure it will divide America more, actually. I think him being on trial for this stuff, um, without having people going through and making it clear what was president and what was not, might divide America more. And besides anything else, let's say when Joe Biden stops being president, for whatever circumstances, could he get prosecuted for stuff he's done as being president? If you set in the presumption that you can prosecute the president, he doesn't have this official immunity, that actually could lead to a much more divisive situation where ex-presidents are being prosecuted all the time. So I think that's very much one of the things the court was looking at when they made this ruling.
Okay, Thomas, stay with us. I'm just going to read a few lines from Chief Justice John Roberts' opinion. He says that this case is not just about the current moment, and it is going to have far-reaching implications for the future. I'm going to quote him now. He says, "This case poses a question of lasting significance. When may a former president be prosecuted for official acts taken during his presidency? Our nation has never before needed an answer. But in addressing that question today, unlike the political branches and the public at large, we cannot afford to fixate exclusively or even primarily on present." So, I mean, it seems to me even the Chief Justice was confused when it came to this particular case.
I wouldn't say confused. I would say that it's very difficult, unprecedented circumstances. You never had a circumstance where a president's been prosecuted before, certainly not for official acts in this way. And so there has to be, I mean, you could say this is a very lawyer's response. There has to be lots of lawyers going through, carving out. You've got to remember that John Roberts worked in the Reagan administration for the executive branch. Most of the other majority of the judges did as well. So I think part of this is, how are you going to draw lines so you can target opinion that would be criminal or that you could argue as criminal if done by a non-president, but also lead a situation where a president is being second guessed for being political or like as in not being second guessed in terms of being put on trial the whole time when he exerts his duties. It's just not a simple issue, which is why it's going to chew up lots of time, because the courts are going to have to sit and look at it. And I think when they come out of it, if the prosecution doesn't get cancelled or suspended, I think they will mostly side against President Trump for this prosecution, but it is actually not a simple matter of working out what's an official act and what's the president in his personal capacity.
Okay, I believe we have a statement from the Biden campaign as well. Biden campaign says immunity ruling does not change the facts. So, I mean, as expected, the Biden campaign, the Biden bloc, the Biden camp has not welcomed this decision.
I mean, that's one. I would actually say that's a surprisingly positive spin on it, which perhaps feeds the point presidents tend to like presidents having more authority. And I think they are obviously correct that whether what President Trump did is illegal is not the same thing as saying it was a good thing. And you could very well take the view that he shouldn't be prosecuted, but this might be a very good reason for swing voters not to vote for him and for vote for President Biden or abstain. And it's no coincidence that lots of former leading Republicans, like his chief of staff, his secretary of defense, are refusing to back President Trump for what we call this, for returning to the presidency. And you can very well hold his behavior in January the 6th against him, even if you think there wasn't any crime at all, separate from the question of presidential immunity. And the Biden campaign are definitely going to be making that case, and it's completely legitimate for them to do so.
Right. Tom, stay with us. I'm just going to read out the statement given by a senior Biden campaign advisor. He says, and I quote, "Donald Trump is snapped after he lost the 2020 election and encouraged a mob to overthrow the results of a free and fair election." I mean, going forward when it comes to President Biden's election campaign, do you think this verdict is going to have an impact on that in any way?
I think it'll probably help Trump slightly, just insofar as it means he won't be stuck in trial. And there'll be probably less coverage of the trial because it will be very technocratic legal arguments rather than making a prosecutor's case, making a defense case. And I would think that would help President Trump at the margins. Obviously, President Biden's not able to campaign very actively, so that might help him a bit more. I would also say that obviously represents the Biden administration campaign's view, which is completely legitimate. But there are lots of other arguments, which is one reason why, even leaving aside the immunity arguments, I think President Trump might end up being okay on these arguments. Like, is it that clear he unleashed the mob? He had a huge demo. He told them to go and protest. He didn't order them to storm the Capitol. Um, and if you set a precedent where politicians give speeches like that, what happens to politicians who give speeches of Black Lives Matters or pro-Palestine rally, and then there's rioting afterwards? Do you start prosecuting them? Like, there's been a very strong trend away from that for the last 100 years in the United States. And if you go back to that trend, President Trump is not going to be the last president to get prosecuted for a riot. The last politician. It could become a very significant part of everyday US politics.
Tom, stay with us. I just want to get some reactions from our North America correspondent, John Brain. John, have you heard anything from the camp of Democrats? I mean, I just read out one statement from a senior advisor to President Biden's campaign. We have already seen a statement come from former U.S. President Donald Trump himself. What more can you tell us?
Both parties, perhaps not surprisingly, are painting this as a victory for their side, and both can do that, really. The Trump team saying, well, a president does have immunity for any official acts, and they'll, of course, be arguing that everything that Donald Trump did after the elections, the 2020 election, constitute an official act. The Democrats are welcoming the fact that presidents do not have authority or immunity from prosecution for unofficial acts. And they argue that everything that Trump did after November 2020, his alleged subversion of the results, was an unofficial act. So of course now it's going to be up to the lawyers to decide which of these two arguments is the correct one. We're going to have heated legal cases now with lawyers on both sides arguing that A, Trump should be prosecuted, or B, should not be prosecuted. But it's clear that whatever the ultimate result, there will be no trial of Donald Trump for election subversion before this year's election. And that in itself is a clear victory for Trump and Trump supporters, because that would have course had a huge impact on the outcome of November. He could have even been convicted. He could potentially have been jailed in the run-up to November's election. That's clearly is not going to happen now. The other case in Florida, where he's accused of withholding documents, much easier for them to argue that that's unofficial duties because he wasn't even president afterwards. But because of all this, that too has been delayed, and it certainly is looking as though, apart from the New York hush money case, that Trump is not facing any legal cases this year in the run-up to the election. And after the election, if he wins the presidency, he'll be able to get all those cases quashed. If he doesn't win the presidency, he could go on trial, but of course it won't have the same significance because he'll neither be the president or a challenger for the presidency.
Fascinating insights. That's John Brain live for us from Washington. John, thank you very much indeed. And now we can go back to Tom Packer. He is a fellow at the University of Oxford's American Institute. He joins me now live from London. So, Tom, you were listening to our correspondent, John Brain. So, as I understand, it's a victory for Donald Trump in two ways. A, he won't be going to trial before the upcoming presidential elections. And B, this ruling has basically rejected a decision from a federal appeals court in February that found that Donald Trump enjoyed no immunity for alleged crimes he committed during his presidency to reverse the 2020 election results.
Yeah, that's both correct. I mean, it's overturned that the ruling that he definitely didn't. It's possible the lower courts, and then if it goes back to the Supreme Court, will go through and say, actually, none of this counts. And the Supreme Court will confirm this. But what they've overturned is the ruling that said you can just assume that. They're saying you have to go into the fine details of the case and look at it and work out the details and see whether ultimately President Trump wasn't committing official actions during that time, wasn't doing his job, so to speak, as president, whether rightly or wrongly. So it's definitely a victory for him. I think most of all just by delaying the case. I think he had lots of other strong legal arguments that might work on appeal. So if you were a normal criminal defendant, it might be a bit double-edged because I think this will delay the case massively or make huge amounts of money for the lawyers. But given he's running a presidential campaign, I'm sure this is great news for him. just because it delays the situation quite a bit.
Right. Tom Packer, thank you very much for talking to us here on TRT World. I really appreciate your taking out the time.